Hey guys, welcome to the Massive Iron channel. I'm Steve Shaw, Massive Iron Podcast. This is the Hypertrophy edition. Today we're going to try to win the Hypertrophy or muscle building for those of you keeping score at home. I have with me today, it's an honor to have with me today, the muscle building Avengers. So without further ado, we have Faz Lifts, not Fad Lifts. We have Geoffrey, Verity, Schofield, and Bryan Boorstein. Did I pronounce your name right, Bryan?
Crushed it.
All right, good. So I'm going to let these sexy creatures introduce themselves. Bryan, you go first. You're kind of new to the channel, so let everybody know where they can find you and what your background is.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm at Bryan Boorstein on Instagram. You can also find me under Evolved Training Systems, which is one of my two brands where I run group programming apps for the most part. And then basically my background is that in ninth grade, I went to the beach one summer and ran into a buddy of mine who I'd been hanging out with in our pre-puberty days. And he had started lifting in the last year. I wanted to be like him. The girls thought it was pretty cool that he was jacked at 15 years old, and I wanted to be that jack guy too. So that combined with my desire to make it onto varsity basketball in as early as possible, I guess, 9th or 10th grade. Those two things kind of combined to get me into the strength and hypertrophy world at that point. I'm 39 now, so almost 25 years of training. Luckily for me, when I started in 1997, the first place I stumbled into was it was an easy board, if anyone remembers those from back in the late 90s. But there was a group called Power and Bulk, and the guy who was the expert in that group was a dude named Paul Carter. So he was my first introduction into things back in the late 90s. And at the time, he basically was just like, dude, compound lifts, get really strong, 3 days a week, full body. And I thought that was incredible advice at the time. I've talked to him since, and he was like, no, that was awful advice. I'd never advise that again. And, that's how it goes sometimes. But I thought it was great advice. And it actually worked really well with me because I was a teenager. I was trying to be social and gain muscle and do all these things. And 3 times a week, full body was perfect. I did that almost all through high school, graduated high school at a massive 5'10", 170. And went to college where I basically changed to a program called Max OT for any of you guys that may or may not remember that. Taught me to work hard, work in relatively low rep ranges, relatively low volumes. So you have to get a lot out of each session. Did that through most of college along with copious amounts of alcohol, and ended up at about 200 pounds at the end of college. And it was it actually, the first 30 pounds came in the freshman year. And then I just spent the next 3 or 4 years still being 200 and just kind of refining that process. Not to be too long winded here, but I then spent 8 or 9 years in CrossFit after college and got really good at Olympic lifting and got relatively strong. Don't think it was super conducive to adding more muscle, given that I was 12 years into training by the time I started CrossFit. Sold my piece of the CrossFit gym in 2016 and dove deep into the evidence-based hypertrophy world in 2017. And man, I started with an RP style approach. That's where I connected with Faz originally in the Revive Stronger group. Yeah. And then since that time, realized kind of some of the pieces of that methodology that don't work super well for me. And I think over the last 5 years, I've kind of curated my own philosophy on training and on progression that suits me really well, has worked really well for other people. And it's kind of like this combination of RP with N1 and 3DMJ, and then some other little things all kind of weaved together. So maybe over the course of the podcast, we'll get into that. But that's where I sit currently, guys.
Thanks, Bryan. Geoffrey, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I'm usually on these kind of podcasts, I'm like the youngin who's training, at least in terms of training age, where I've only been lifting 8 years. So I started pretty late. I was originally a runner. And
wait, what?
Yeah. So I started at 15 years old, and that's, I guess what taught me to work hard, gave me a lot of work capacity. And I was, often injured as a runner. I wish I could go back and combine the passion with a little bit of intelligence and wisdom because you really do need both when it comes to running and also lifting. And so I started lifting when I was 25 years old and, gradually progressed, learned a lot, wasted a lot of time, but it's been pretty productive overall. And then, I'm just continuing to educate myself. A lot of the names you mentioned, Bryan, I follow and they all put out good content, but I think it's imperative to, if you're an individual, you have to just take it all and then incorporate it into your own plan, because you can learn a lot from other people, but it all has to be applied to yourself in a certain way. And it's not just copy paste, but it's like, I take this and then I experiment and then I see if it works or not. And I think that's sort of the beauty of training, really.
Geoffrey, how long have you been involved with lifting?
8 years. Yeah. So some people might think that's a long time. Sometimes I tell people, I've been lifting 8 years, and they're like, whoa, that's such a long time. But then, I talk to guys like Bryan or guys like, everyone in this podcast and, Dave McConey. And they're just like, yeah, you're not really, advanced to the point where you're like putting on a pound a year or something, so I'm still experiencing, not quite newbie gains, but like some nice, not super advanced gains, I guess.
Yeah, I've been watching you over the last year, and like he's getting close to the cap. He's getting close to the super grind stage. So, but you're right on track. You might be the newbie as far as number of years in this group, but you're about 20 years ahead of me as far as knowledge, because I grew up in the dinosaur era, where all you had was Joe Weider's Muscle and Fitness. So, Faz, how about you?
Yeah, so Faz Lifts on Instagram and YouTube. So I got started around about the same time as Bryan. I think our paths have crossed a few times over the years, over the last couple of decades, which is pretty cool. When I got started, I almost immediately, just accidentally, dropped into this entire world of online strength. And I competed in my first powerlifting competition after about 9 months of training. And I'd competed in powerlifting for about 12 years. Was just obsessed with strength. And along the way, met you, Steve, in about 2007, 8-ish on the Muscle and Brawn forums, which is very cool. At that point, I was just full on into powerlifting. And I really did that for over a decade, powerlifting with a little bit of strongman smattered in, which I just loved it. I was obsessed by it. It was great. Then ran into sort of injuries, kind of retired from powerlifting, meandered around for a few years, started picking up some coaching clients, just local people who just said, look, he could see I was passionate about training and about strength, wanted me to coach him. So I did. And that was about, 5, 6, 7 years ago now. Then started to become more of a formal thing, left my previous profession, started to do this full time. And so now I'm full-time coach and also compete in bodybuilding. So across 20 years, I've been competitive pretty much the whole time for about 2 decades across 3 strength sports. Never competed in CrossFit, maybe at some point. Next thing might be doing a sort of a reverse evolution of Geoffrey and going to do a marathon, or at least a half marathon, potentially. We'll see. But I think I've probably got 1 or 2 more competitions left in me. So maybe another bodybuilding show would be nice. The past few years' events have kind of put a hold on that. But I think I'm not quite out for the count yet. So yeah, that's kind of me and where I'm at.
So I think I'd like to start with kind of this line of discussion. 3 of us have been around lifting on the internet since 2000. Sorry, Geoffrey, but you probably are well aware of this. But like back then, when we first got on the internet, muscle building, there were muscle building programs, there were muscle building discussions, and somewhere along the line, kind of the strength world wedged itself into muscle building and deconstructed everything and just broke everything down into what I like to call the cult of barbell. Like, just do your barbell exercises, your 5s, your minimal programs, and your full bodies, and your muscle protein synthesis, and all the other bodybuilding stuff was kind of kicked out the door a little bit, in the sense that like so many guys nowadays are using, I've been influenced by that strength side of things, that we've kind of lost a lot of the art of bodybuilding. Faz, I'll start with you. What do you think we've lost in the last 20 years and we need to regain?
Yeah, I mean, this goes right back to where I got my start in lifting. So, around about the time I was on the same board as you, Bryan, back in 2000, I was also on another board called Hard Gainer. I actually wrote for them, wrote articles for them, and I was really into that whole sort of hard gainer way of thinking. And it was very, very minimalistic. Essentially, just do your big exercises, micro load. And the idea was if you approached the cycle steadily enough, like you were a hunter approaching prey, right? You just micro-loaded steadily up to your max. You would just surpass it, and then gains would be yours, and forever you'd be fantastic. And you'd be the classic sort of Charles Atlas on the beach type of scene. That was the idea. Hardly ever worked for anyone, but they all insisted that was the right way to do things. They still insist that's the right way to do things 20 years later. They're all still small. And it got to the point about 2 years into that, I realized it wasn't working. I got up to about a 200-pound bench, a 350 squat, and about a 450 deadlift. And I was a competitive powerlifter at the time, so they were embarrassing numbers. And so I went to these guys, went to the hard gainers, and I said, look, what's going on? I'm stalling. I'm doing everything else right. I'm gaining weight. And they said, look, you're just at your genetic limit. You're done. Bear in mind, I was 19, 20 years old. 200-pound bench. I was like 19, 20 years old. And I specifically remember that conversation. And you can tell I feel bad about it because that was 18 years ago and I still remember it. So it hurt me. And I refused to believe that. So I broke off. And that was my sort of long ascent into more than just a basic minimalistic barbell, cult of barbell type of routines, and also just higher expectations all around. Very much went into, I think a couple of strands really. I think the higher volumes are intensely useful, and not just for bodybuilding, for powerlifting too. Right the way throughout my strength training career, I did lots and lots of volume. And as well as that, moving away from barbells and moving to adding in volume via machines in intelligent ways. So I think if I've lost anything, it's the breadth of what encompasses hypertrophy training. It's not just get stronger on the compounds and only do those. There's more to it.
Yeah. So Geoffrey, I think that person, the person that had advised Faz that he was at his genetic potential came over to you and wanted to microload weight over the course of 20 years. That might be the same person.
Yeah, actually, that reminded me. That explains why you reacted to my post that way. Yes. And I actually have a video. I already filmed it. I just have to edit it. And the video title is going to be "Typical Hard Gainer Bullshit." Yeah, because like I could tell, like that's something that you're passionate about and you got worked up about.
Right there.
Yeah. So
Geoffrey, you came in at an interesting spot into the muscle building world where you have a more fleshed out, well-rounded. Like when I see your advice, I'm like, this guy gets it. This guy gets it, and he didn't get caught into the traps or the pitfalls of the minimal type of shtick. Like, how did you escape that trap? And I hate to call it a trap because all lifting is good lifting and let's get stronger and all that kind of stuff. But how did you not initially just jump into doing your 5s with 3 barbell exercises? How did you develop a more well-rounded perspective?
I think part of it is just luck, right? Like whatever program you stumble across first, that's going to give you your newbie gains almost regardless. I mean, beginners gain from cardio. It's just like anything will work pretty well, at least for some amount of time. Even something like a basic 5x5. Is it going to be great after that? Probably not. And so sometimes people get trapped in their first program or their first system, and it can be very dogmatic, and they'll defend this program online, even if it's not really working for them currently.
Right.
And, it's one of those things where maybe I just got lucky, right? Like I didn't stumble into any real fixed way of thinking. I spent a lot of time on T Nation, which is mixed, right? Like some good, some very much not so good, but it had a variety of authors, a variety of writers. It wasn't just, 2 people or 1 person. And so that helped a lot. I think I kind of approached it with a running mentality, which is not good for strength, but for hypertrophy, I think, just doing more, doing it harder can work well if you survive. Maybe if you're advanced, you need a little bit more of a surgical approach where you incorporate, better quote unquote SFR exercises, and, you're a little bit more methodical and surgical with how you approach things. But I think if you're a beginner and you have good work capacity and you can recover, I think just smashing it and eating a lot. I mean, I gained 20 pounds in my first 2 months of training. 20 pounds, 9 kilos in 2 months. And it wasn't all muscle. Let's throw that out there. But like, it was still a good amount of food and a good amount of work. And I looked quite different pretty rapidly after training. And then, I think you have to keep evolving because you're going to have to keep training a little bit differently with every phase of training. So you hear like, oh, advanced athletes need to do so much volume. Maybe not, right? Because at that time, you're probably stronger. And if you want to do that volume, maybe you have to break it up in a more manageable way. At that time, injuries do happen. Let's be realistic. And so I think it's important to realize that training is always an evolving process, right? Evolved training system. It's something that you have to realize what worked in the past might not work in the future. And you have to, just keep learning and experimenting.
I want to get back to the aggressive eating thing, in just a minute, because there's a point I'd like to discuss with you guys. But before we do so, Bryan, when did you jump into the internet world of lifting?
Yeah, I mean, it was literally right when I started. It was 1997, and that was pretty much where I started getting all my initial information. Faz mentioned Hard Gainer, and like I must have subconsciously blocked that period of time out of my brain. But I also was on the Hard Gainer board as well. And I have like literally the moment you said that, all these names of like the people in that group started flooding back to me of like the people giving advice. And like, you remember Cyberpump, the website that had all of the hit information on it, and some of those guys on Hard Gainer wrote for Cyberpump. Yeah. So again, like I think ultimately, like if you look at just a bird's eye view general population, I don't think that focusing on compound movements is necessarily a bad idea when you first start. I think probably the bad idea was, let's just do one top set of 3 different exercises and call that a session and then rest for 4 days.
Right. Every 2 weeks.
Yeah. I think what they advised me was 2 times a week training, where it was like one day was squat, press, row. And then the other day was deadlift, pull up, bench, or something along those lines. But it was literally just one top set of each one. And then you microload your way until, progressive overload happens. Like magic. So yeah, it was right in the beginning that I did. But after Hard Gainer, falling into the power and bulk forum was great. And kind of my view on that volume curve throughout your training life is probably that the beginning of your training, you don't need as much, just because you're going to respond to anything, right? So you can do compound movements and you can get those newbie gains. Your arms will grow from doing, overhead presses and rows and stuff like that. And then you reach intermediate stage, where I think that you probably have to do the most volume. And the reason you probably have to do the most volume is because you have adapted, you have this little bit of anabolic resistance, but your form isn't precise enough yet to get the most out of every rep that you're doing. And then you reach this advanced stage where it's kind of like the training changes. It almost becomes this like cathartic, somewhat parasympathetic experience where, you're going in and it's like playing golf. Like the precision of your execution is so paramount that you're able to progressively do less and less and less over time, because you're getting better and better at these movements. And that's kind of the way I see the curve for most people. And then I think that at least for Faz and I, that we find ourselves a little bit more on that side where, hey, we can get a whole shit ton out of 2 work sets, where maybe before it was 4 work sets that we had to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to highlight that from what Geoffrey said, because one of the things is you do get stronger, but as you get more advanced, your ability to hone into the muscle gets just that much more enhanced. And I've seen from Bryan, from your training videos, like your ability to tap into the muscle is fantastic. So your volume goes right down at that stage. So I completely agree with what you're saying. It's been my experience as well. The most volume when you're in intermediate, and the volume loads go down actually as you're in advanced, just because the quality of the work is that much higher.
We had Berto on my podcast like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he has spent the last year specializing in delts and arms. And so I was asking him about his volume. I'm talking about Alberto Nunez for anyone that didn't know Berto. But basically he was saying that like his shoulder and arm volume. Yeah, just Berto, guys. Come on.
There's only one Berto, yeah.
So he said his shoulders and arms volume was the lowest it's ever been, and yet he spent the last year specializing in it. And so I was like, what do you think your volume is going to do over the course of the next couple of years, and things like that, like progressively from there? And he goes, I just think it's going to keep getting lower because I just keep getting better at recruiting like the exact area that I want to. So I thought that kind of explained the perspective pretty well.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting point. The more everybody likes to talk around work harder work, but the more efficient you become with your sets, it's almost like you're not as obsessed with set volume, but overall quality. I want to talk about work capacity because we touched on that a little bit, and Geoffrey and I just made videos recently about work capacity. As folks that deal with the general public and lifters that want to make progress, one of the things we see is we will give out a program to someone based on their needs, and you never know if someone is going to just crush it, they're just going to handle it really well, or after like the first exercise, they're going to come back and be like, I can't handle this volume, this intensity, this work capacity. So how important is it for those types of individuals? Because a lot of times they want to move everything around the board. So the fourth exercise feels easier. The third exercise feels more manageable. How important is it for them to take building up their work capacity seriously?
Who's that for?
Anybody want to jump in?
I think there's a lot to be said for having a sort of an athletic background and coming into lifting weights. And if somebody's coming to me with more of a sporting background, they've played tennis or basketball or whatever, it almost always is an easier time. One would think the guy who's has the ability to eat a lot, is quite heavy, is going to make quite good progress, but it's almost never the case. I found a few things to be true while I've been coaching is guys who've got athletic backgrounds, but also guys who are generally very active tend to do the best. So guys who've got high step count, like 10, 15,000, they just tend to gain the best in terms of muscle over time. Just the way it is. You'd think it would be the opposite, but as long as they are out eating the deficit they're creating with the cardio, whatever they're doing, the activity, they almost always gain better. And I think it's to do with having a better engine. I think Geoffrey, you and I had this conversation on your comments, and we were talking about, I think somebody asked you about your ability to grind. And I said, almost certainly your aerobic background is of benefit to that because you just have a higher ability to just push through the pain. It's like a boxer going 12 rounds. If you're conditioned to that, you just have more of a fight in you. And I think a lot of that is what it boils down to. If we take it down to the minutiae, the actual set execution, if you're in better condition, you're going to be able to hold those positions better in a given set. You'll be able to execute the set better. And not only that, but you'll be able to go further in the set, more towards the effective muscle stimulation you need. So almost always we have to move beyond looking at these clients as just bodybuilders. We have to expand their base, and that involves their conditioning, their ability to maintain the correct positions when they are training, and their ability to just mentally push. And I think the mental fortitude thing gets overplayed more so than the actual physical fortitude. Like they need to be conditioned to be able to train properly.
Yeah. It's one of those things where I did a full upper body hypertrophy workout, and it was 27 sets, and a bunch of them were isolation. I forget the exact, breakdown, but it was more than half isolation. It was like a not an easy workout, but it was not anything close to what I've done in the past. I mean, I was looking through my training log, after making that video because of all the comments that I got saying, oh my God, this is so much. Like, how do you recover? Oh, this is like, how are you not destroyed? Like, oh, I'd be done after 4 sets or something like that. And I've done German volume training on deadlifts more than 20 times. And that's way harder than like any of it was at like 75% of my 1 rep max, which I don't talk about that kind of stuff because people just, they either call BS or they're just like, oh, that's crazy. And it is. But then like when I tell someone something that I find like very moderate and reasonable, and then they're like, oh, that's crazy. Imagine what they would think if I actually told them some crazy shit, like doing German volume training on deadlifts and doing 3 sets of 20 after, stuff like that. Just like unnecessarily difficult. but it makes the necessarily difficult stuff that much easier. And I think, just being generally in good shape is so useful. Like, Bryan, I'm sure your CrossFit experience definitely helped just with your work capacity and conditioning, like lactate threshold, all that kind of stuff. Like,
yeah, I'm notoriously really bad at conditioning. That was actually like the Achilles heel and the thing that held me back in CrossFit. But I think it's also part of the reason, like, I don't exactly know the right way to say this, but I would present an alternative view on work capacity and say that there is certainly a point where your work capacity can get too high to the point that now you have to do so much volume that it's like a time sink and potentially, additional stress on your body. Like 25 years in, something I consider a lot is, why would I want to do 25 sets if I can get something for 10 sets or something like that? And if work capacity gets to the point that it's so high, then I think I would reach a point where I would need to do more volume. And then that's not even to get into things that like potential slow twitch muscle fiber conversion and things like that may occur. So I mean, there's definitely arguments to both sides of it. I wouldn't want work capacity to be super high, but I wouldn't want my athlete to be extremely out of shape either. And I like the idea of using step counts and stuff because it's a super low intensity way for you to just like get your ticker moving and like breathe a little bit, focus on some nasal breathing and like get your oxygen supply flowing through your body and stuff without having to go through the gauntlet of intervals and other like high intensity protocols that probably would spike that VO2 max and then make volume more of a requirement for your training. So like for me, man, at this point in training, I'm my back as a whole is taking 11 sets a week right now. Lateral delts are 9, and then everything else is between 7 and 8. Total sets per week. And so that's like the lowest volume I've ever done. And I think that like, I still do 15K steps a day, but that is providing sufficient stimulus for me. Whereas when I think my work capacity was higher, like in the CrossFit days, man, the amount of volume I was doing was nuts because I could type thing.
Yeah. I don't know if there's a sensitization issue there. Like there might be, yeah. It's just super hard to study. They do take groups where they add volume, they subtract volume based on what they'd previously been doing. But volume research is just so hard to pin down. Then you have the failure issue as well. How do you actually measure that? Who's actually going to failure? The study environment, the authors, like it's just, this is one area where scientific research is just so, it's going to take a long time to actually get like enough high quality studies to actually like paint a really good picture of volume and resensitization and like, can you be too conditioned? I guess, theoretically maybe. But I think for the average person, yeah, probably it's better to err on the side of a little bit too much. And, you can just say, hey, like, are you getting out of breath during your sets? I guess it depends on your training style as well. Like if you're doing more minimalistic type of training structure, it's probably more compounds. And so, work capacity might be more of an issue. So yeah, a lot of factors.
I think that it's relatively easy to sort of signpost where your ideal kind of volume range is. If you're doing too little, you're feeling pretty fresh, you can do more. If you do too much, after a while, I'm not sure if you guys feel the same way, but it just ends up feeling very samey. Like you do a lot of volume, you just get very good at doing a lot of volume. You stop getting decent pumps. Yeah, you should stop getting decent pumps. Nothing really feels good anymore, and you're just really good at doing stuff. So I find if I'm pumping volume up a lot more than sort of I normally do, which for me is about the 12 to 16 range, if I pump up volume to the 20 set range or maybe more than that, pretty much soon after a while, I just stop getting much from it. I really stop getting great pumps. And then when I go back down to 12 to 16, I get much better pumps and everything just feels better. And I know the pump isn't everything, but it gives me a good range of, okay, this just feels good. So I know very quickly when I've done too much. And if I do that for a long time, stuff just doesn't feel right. So I think you have signposts to say, okay, you should probably stay in this range for you.
There's also the balance of like volume and intensity where, if I were to do a program with 20 sets per muscle group, it would be like 3 or 4 RIR almost across the board versus like my protocol now, it's like a much closer proximity to failure in general.
After I lost weight, when I got sucked into the powerlifting world about 2007, I'd say for about 8 years, it was more minimal type of training, just focused on the barbell lifts. And before that, I had done a lot of volume. And after I'd lost weight, I returned to volume training. Like my sessions were 90 minutes of just warfare. I would do a lot of volume, and I was single again. I had nothing to do but live in the gym and beat the living heck out of my body. And it helped me accomplish a lot of things. It was a good experience. But after a while, it just started to feel a little bit redundant and a little bit like overkill. And where I'm at right now, a lot of people are like, why don't you post your workouts? Well, my workouts really aren't as epic as they were back then, because I'm literally in and out of the gym in like 45 or 50 minutes now. And that includes, doing a couple sets of deadlifts. I'm trying to get more out of my sets rather than do more. And I just, I've been through the volume phase, but I just tend to enjoy my training more now. Getting back to my roots, because a lot of people, Geoffrey, look at me like a power lifter, and I made a video about Geoffrey being weak, but that's how, my roots for 20 years, I just trained like a bodybuilder. And I find being able to not obsess about volume and just being able to kind of, enjoy my training and see what I can get out of every set. I'm just finding I enjoy it a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like just the ability to do work is nice, but sometimes taking the other side of the other point of view where it's like, yeah, I could do that, but I'm not, right? Like I could do this many sets, but I'm not, because just because you can recover doesn't mean you can actually benefit from it, right? Like,
Right.
So you have max recoverable volume, your performance can stabilize, but you might not necessarily be growing. And I've definitely encountered that where, I've done just stupid volumes, right? Like 60, 70 sets per workout, all to failure or very close. I could probably get away with that because I'm not very strong, right? And I'm not using like very, very heavy weights. If I was, I would have to do less volume. And, you can sort of get away with that for a time, but after a while, and especially as you get stronger, yeah, you're probably going to have to be a little bit more surgical with things.
And I don't want anybody to take me the wrong way. I still like going into the gym and having the ability to do something ridiculous, or, having the freedom to do more volume, or to run the rack or run the stack or do something ridiculous. Faz, back in the day of Muscle and Brawn, I think we had something called Ustream. I don't know if it still exists to this day, but I did a workout. I streamed it. It was a 5-hour workout. Why, I don't know. You just wake up some days and you're like, I'm going to be like Geoffrey, Verity, Schofield today and do something ridiculous. And I did like 315 on the bar, and I had 2 bars, one with 315 and one with 135. And I would do as many reps of deadlifts as I could stand, and then I would move over and do as many reps of power high pulls as I could stand. And I ended up doing 300 reps of each over 5 hours. And why, I don't know. I think I was just, hey, I have 5 hours this morning. Let's earn some food. I don't know. But it just reminded me of what you said, Geoffrey, and some of your epic why not workouts.
Yeah.
So
I actually think.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I actually think that maybe there's a scientific rationale. Like maybe extreme muscle damage could provoke satellite cell activation or something, right? Like there's probably some way to scientifically justify it.
we can find an abstract to support it for sure.
I think there's just simply a degree of mental illness involved. There's something broken in the brain where you're just like, hey, this sounds like fun. Geoffrey, you mentioned aggressive eating. I believe it was you, or Bryan, you mentioned it, gaining a lot of weight your first
in first year of college. Yeah.
Geoffrey, you mentioned it as well, correct? I gained when I went to college. I kind of came from a poor family where we didn't have food around. It's just like everything was like bologna and cheese sandwiches and Campbell's soup. That was my high cuisine as a kid. I went off to college and they had a buffet style cafeteria. And that's when I really started lifting. And I gained 30 pounds in like 2 years. And my muscle mass just like exploded. Now, here's what I want to ask you guys. We don't tend to advocate aggressive bulks because most people aren't training like we trained during the time when we had those aggressive bulks. Would you agree or disagree? Were you training pretty much, right on track during that time?
Yeah, and it kind of coincided with me hitting like my stride in puberty too. Like I went to college at like 18, 19, and I was late to puberty anyways. So at 18, 19, it was like, acne all over my face, like just testosterone flowing through my whole body. And it just made sense that I'd eat a whole ton of cafeteria fried chicken sandwiches and lift hard. And I grew. It happened. It's just like Geoffrey, I gained 30 pounds in 8 months, like freshman year of college. It wasn't all muscle for sure. It was probably like half and half, something like that. But 15 pounds of muscle in a year is fucking solid, man.
Makes a difference. I've got to throw in my book story as well. Then the year before I started lifting, I did a Geoffrey and I did loads of cardio and I dropped 50 pounds. So I was a real chubby kid, right? So I got down to something ridiculous like 150 pounds. And so the year I started lifting, I gained 40 pounds. Wow. And that was the year. So I kind of gained a lot of it back. I got up to 190 pounds, but just like you, Bryan, like a lot of that was muscle. So I was a pretty jacked 19-year-old kid all of a sudden out of nowhere. Yeah. And that was on those minimalistic routines, which gave me the false sense of belief that this might be something until I rammed into a wall and I realized I probably wasn't going to gain another 40 pounds or a heart attack at 19 years old might have been coming. But yeah, that was my book story. 40 pounds gain. It was fun. Wish I could do that again.
So Geoffrey, we should do that again. I did it, nearly killed me, but I got pretty strong. So Geoffrey, I'm going to toss this your way.
Worth it?
Hey, it was worth it for about 4 months.
I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking.
Geoffrey, I'm going to toss this your way. Like the average person watching is like, they're talking about aggressive bulks, but on the other hand, when everybody talks about bulks, they talk about regulating it and going slow and steady. Alpha Destiny, when I talked to him recently, he mentioned his best strength gains were when he was just doing a ridiculous bulk. So people watching are going to be like, hey, I want to do a ridiculous bulk. But the question is, if you haven't gained a lot of muscle, what does your training look like to have to get all the mojo you can out of that aggressive bulk?
Yeah, so I look at it like the better your training and your diet and your sleep and your stress and your lifestyle, all the factors are, the more aggressive you can be in a bulk and get away with it. And the same also goes in a cut. Like the more you are quote unquote optimizing everything, you're getting 8 or 9 hours of sleep, your stress is low, going through puberty, whatever. You could be aggressive in a cut and maintain all your muscle or even gain some. Or if you're bulking up, you can really be aggressive with the surplus. And so when I see, when I have a younger client and everything on paper looks really, really good, the training's on point, et cetera, and they're like, 200 calorie surplus or 100 calorie surplus, neither, right? Like try 5 times that, and, you can calculate out the surplus, but 20 pounds in 2 months, a lot is water, a lot is glycogen, et cetera. But, you can be aggressive with things and get away with it. And I don't want to say fat loss is easy because it's something that a lot of people struggle with. And I don't want to trivialize that. But compared to muscle growth,
right,
it's fucking easy, right? Like it's just every pound of muscle you put on is a precious, precious gift. And you don't want to screw yourself out of any of those. Like those are, we fight for those right now. And so when beginners are just like giving those up, it's like, it's an insult to the people who are more advanced, right? And so I like to live vicariously through clients' newbie gains, right? Like it's nice. And so I would say, err on the side of being a little bit more aggressive. And in terms of like numbers, 500 to, I must have been in 1,000 calorie surplus just based on the numbers in my initial bulk. I survived, right? Like, I put on muscle and I put on fat, but, I lost the fat later, and it was it's not a journey I regret by any means.
I just got to interject real quick. When I bumbled and stumbled into the world of online lifting forums, just a blockhead with having never talked to other lifters, and I'm like, just train hard and eat a lot of food and eat aggressively. I was clubbed like a seal. I remember those beatings well. But it's been a good learning process since. But you also learn that a lot of people aren't ready for that yet. So Faz, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I agree with what Geoffrey says. And I think the other side of the coin, though, is I think with Alpha Destiny's book and also with Geoffrey's book, you could see they weren't getting sloppy. Like they've both got a very good body fat distribution. So even at his largest, Alex had pretty even body fat distribution. His belly wasn't hanging out and stuff. And I think where this becomes dangerous, and certainly I've got sort of clients that I work with, is they've got really poor body fat distribution, and probably is a signal for it's not a good idea if you're gaining a lot of weight and it's all going on your stomach and there's all that visceral fat and all the. It just points to we need to be a bit more moderate. So I think it's a great thing to do if you can get away with it. And it usually means you're in a good spot health-wise and you've got a lot of muscle to gain. But I think if you're verging on the point of you're starting to look sloppy, it's really time to pull it back. So even at the height of your bulk, Geoffrey, I think you showed those pictures. I think you look great, dude. And like you had a relatively flat stomach and it was just good body fat distribution all around. I thought, okay, it showed that you weren't getting sloppy. So I think to kind of put that proviso out there, like it's great to do these bulks and to get the mass because it's harder to get mass, easier to chop up the fat. But if you're already in a position where you've perhaps got some unhealthy looking body fat, you've got to really think long and hard about that. And maybe it might be worth just hitting maintenance for a while and being a bit more moderate.
So Bryan, I'm going to toss this to you. How do you manage someone in their calorie surplus? What are your kind of criteria? Do you put folks on more aggressive bulks, and do you have certain things you look for?
Yeah, so I would say I don't put people on aggressive bulks at this point unless they're in their like early stages of training and I feel like they can get a lot out of that. And then to be completely transparent, I probably don't work with too many people in their early stages anymore. I'm able to be a little bit more selective. So the majority of people I work with have 10, 15 plus training years under them. But reflecting on kind of, the early stages of my eating and bulking and things like that, and those around me that I had worked with in the past, I feel like almost forcing progression is important because you have this philosophical view of progressive overload, right? Where it's become really popular in evidence-based space these days, where it's like, hey, adding weight to the bar is a consequence of you gaining muscle. So you don't have to put weight on the bar. You can just kind of keep going through the motions, do the thing. And eventually the weight's going to be so light that you're like, fuck it. I need to put weight on because it's just not challenging anymore. And in reality, like that doesn't happen so often. I love the idea in theory. Like it sounds beautiful, right? Like, oh, we'll just wait. And then the world will tell me when it's time to add weight to the bar. But I think especially when you're in a surplus, having confident additions to the bar each week is super important. And what that is probably depends on the stage of training that you're at, where a newbie can go 5 pounds, and intermediate can go 2 pounds, and an advanced person might take some sort of. What I like to do is increase intensity across a mesocycle. So you're essentially comparing like week 1 to week 1 of the next mesocycle and week 5 to week 5 of the next mesocycle type thing. So I think, the rate of progress obviously depends on where you are in your training journey. And so, yeah, that'd be my thoughts on that.
I'm going to pull out probably my least favorite 3 words in muscle building. Just to get you guys' reaction, muscle protein synthesis. I say they're my least favorite words because somewhere along the line, lifting became only about frequency training and muscle protein synthesis, and everything else was discounted and had to die if it didn't revolve around muscle protein synthesis, meaning the concept that you had to train with X frequency or else you weren't going to, the thought was you weren't going to get anything out of your training. So I want to kind of ask you guys, are there anything in specific? That's kind of the thing that triggers me. You know, we have to think more than just about muscle protein synthesis and frequency training. Are there any things in the modern hypertrophy landscape that are kind of evoke that same reaction to you guys?
For me, I think it's the train to failure versus not train to failure argument. It just seems so entirely irrelevant to the training process that it amazes me that people have literal fights about it, because I don't think it contributes anything at all meaningful to the conversation.
Well, I got to interject. The whole Lyle Dr. Mike thing got me through the pandemic run during the pandemic. Just tune in each day to see what was going on.
How the speed of concentric is supposed to slow as you get closer to failure type thing. That's the one you're talking about.
The whole shebang. I just think it's secondary to progression. And it makes for good content. It makes for good social media content, but it also forces people into camps, and then it throws them off what the main objective is, which is to progress. And I think that I don't really, from a coach's perspective, I don't like it. As entertainment, it's great, obviously, and all the Fallout videos from it are fantastic. But as a coach, I think it's fairly meaningless. So that's probably the thing that grinds my gears the most. It's the arguing over the minutiae. I'm not a fan of.
Along the same lines as that with the failure debate, I feel like one of the things that irks me is with all this new research coming out, and in mass and Zordos and Helms and those guys talking about how, hey, you can get hypertrophy at 7 reps from failure or 8 reps from failure, and then you have all these little guys on the internet being like, see, I don't need to train to failure, I can do 6 reps shy, and literally I'm just like, bro, if you just fucking work hard and eat food, it sounds so simple, but and also, oh man, those guys will acknowledge that you have to do more volume if you're further from failure. But where is that point? If I'm going to work at 7 RIR, do I have to do 12 sets per exercise, or what's the number? And no one's telling me that. They're just like, yeah, you can get equivalent hypertrophy at 7 reps from failure. And you're just like, yeah, but I have to be in the gym for 7 hours. I don't know. There's just an opportunity cost there that kind of doesn't make sense to me.
You see them train and it's far too civilized, and you're thinking to yourself, this is not what training should look like.
Far too civilized. Yeah, exactly. Hashtag TikTok, right? If you have time to watch 7 TikTok videos in between sets.
The whole RIR thing, I think, is a tough one, because I do like the RIR concept, but I think most people they misapply, or I won't say most people because that's a bit silly, but I think it can be misapplied very frequently. Training can be too intellectualized, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Exercise science in general, it's something that is so often misapplied, and I see it all the time, or people ask for a study about why I'm doing something. Right. I mean, I used to have exercise or evidence-based in my Instagram bio. I took that shit out because people are always just like, oh, you got a PubMed link? Why? For doing a seated dumbbell shoulder press, really? Or anything, know? And so, scientific studies always just looking at one variable, how much volume is this, how much intensity, frequency, or progression. And it's almost never looking at the interaction. But that's what's actually training, right? If you move one lever, you've got to move some other levers. Otherwise, the training stress is going to be way too high or way too low. And it's just I see so many people basing their training decisions on exercise science. That's on other people. Yeah. You're discounting your own experiences from something on other people that is only tracking one variable. And it's just this disconnect, which is really hard to get through to those people. And I used to be one of those people. That's why evidence-based was in my fucking bio.
Do you know what the shit thing is about all that, right? Going back 20 years, right? Those guys are almost always on the wrong side of the argument as well. Because Bryan, you mentioned Cyberpump, right? Do you remember how technical those guys used to get to convince you to only do It's like 10-second concentrics, 10-second eccentrics. They had all the science laid out. These hit Jedis that we used to call them on the forums. They'd come in, swoop into conversations, tear apart everyone in quotes, and like try and answer everything back just to say that they were right about one set. But they're always on the wrong side of the argument. And like, it's one of those things where I get very skeptical when I see all these heavily scientifically evidence-based bros. And I just think back to 20 years ago or to 10 years ago, they always seem to be on the wrong side of the argument. And I don't want to generalize, but it makes you think after a while.
Can I
go ahead?
Sorry, I was just trying to bring up one piece of nuance that I think is super relevant. I think Geoffrey at least would agree with me on this. Is one of the things we're seeing now that's super cool, and I wish people would actually think more about, is how there's a major difference in the way that you can implement a movement that would be more of like a lengthened overload versus that of a short overload, and a different fatigue cost and a different stimulus, or a higher stimulus on lengthened versus short, and like how much volume you can do of each and things like that. And so I think that that's like a really cool piece of where we are in the industry right now, where it's kind of separating the idea of looking at those movements like, hey, doing an RDL and doing a leg curl are they're going to train differently, but there's significantly different fatigue costs. And then kind of going into some of the stuff that Geoffrey and I have been doing with like lengthened partials and things like that, like obviously something you can't do on an RDL. Like you're not going to go to the bottom and then just kind of like oscillate up and down until your back gives out. Whereas on something like a seated cable row or a T-bar row, which Jeff and I both do a lot, chest supported, right? You can take that thing to failure and then get 10 more reps before you're actually unable to move it. So there's all of this stimulus that we can get at this lengthened portion of the movement that we would never get if we just stopped at concentric failure.
Yeah.
You know, Bryan, you touched on. Sorry, go ahead, Geoffrey.
Oh, sorry. I've been using those for a while, and they've been really, really effective. And it is one of those things where, you know, people might ask, "Hey, how many reps do you keep in the tank on rows?" None. I keep -5 reps, -10 reps. Like, what are you talking about? Like, failure is not much. And like, if I hear 2 reps in reserve, 3 reps in reserve on, you know, a chest supported row, I mean, it's just like you'd have to do so much volume. And this is where I got into that trap of volume. I was still training very, very hard, but I wasn't maybe training as focused or with the right technique or, you know, activating the right areas. And so, you know, I hear 45 sets per week, a Schoenfeld study, and I think, well, damn it, I have high work capacity. I've got to do 40, 50, 60 sets per week. And I did. And, you know, that's not something I would ever advocate. But, you know, it's something that you look back and you're like, hey, I did this because of this. And I know I'm not the only one. And this is where you have to be able to put scientific research in context.
One of the areas of hypertrophy that bothers me is when we try, and Bryan touched on this a little bit, and this gave me this kind of fired me up a little bit, is that we try to apply things equally to all exercises, like all exercises are equal. All exercises can be trained to failure. All exercises can't be trained to failure. There's black and white. You can do this with all exercises, or you can't do this with all exercises. Even reps in reserve. A barbell row is super easy to take to failure. Your speed slows down, and even then you can do a little bit of cheatiness to get a little bit of extra mojo post failure out of it, whereas you couldn't do that on a squat without really increasing the injury risk. One thing that bothers me in the lifting landscape is the constant naive application of one rule to all exercises when the demands of every exercise are different and it requires nuance. Does that make sense?
Yeah. When I so kind of as I've gone through and over the years formulated kind of my own progression model, right? That's exactly what I do. Is the way that I progress across a mesocycle in a lengthened overload movement like a squat or an RDL or something like that is going to essentially follow like a 4-3-2-1-0 type RIR thing where each week I'm just going to add some weight or a rep, and eventually, you know, over 5 or 6 weeks, I'll probably end up close to failure. And that's good for me because those movements are fucking fatiguing, and there's a lot of stimulus for RIR, right? But I'm going to start my mesocycle on like a cable spider curl or like a row of some sort. Like I'm going to start that at 1 RIR, and then the next week I'm going to go to 0 RIR. And then by week 3, I'm doing partials. And by week 4, I'm doing a reverse drop set. And week 5, I'm doing a reverse drop set with fucking more weight, or I don't know, like there's all of these different ways that you can progress through. And the way that a short overload movement is progressed shouldn't go 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 the same way that an RDL does that, right? It just there's more stimulus to get. And like my brain doesn't like randomness. Like I'm not somebody that just wants to go in and be like, fuck it, every set of rows I'm doing, every curl I'm doing, we're just doing partials from the get-go, you know, like I want to still see some sort of, so starting that progression at 1 RIR and then going to 0 and then adding intensity techniques and partials and stuff after that just fits with the structure that my brain wants while still providing me some of that intensity in the last 2, 3, 4 weeks of a mesocycle.
Yeah, well, I think that's where people run into the volume trap, because if they're not, they have to push something. And if you're not pushing the intensity up and you're not adding those techniques, then they just think, well, more volume's the answer. Surely, if I'm going 4 RIR, then 3 RIR, I'm not feeling anything. Let's just add more on top. I can recover. And so you run into this trap of just continuously adding volume in. So I think that's a big problem.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody comes to me and they say, I'm doing 3 RIR, you know, in spider curls, my brain is like, what? I don't even. I've been training for 37 years. I have no idea what that is. Could you?
I'm gonna tear a bicep.
Yeah, I really don't. Like that's way too much calculus for me. As you mentioned, you know, Geoffrey mentioned taking out the evidence base out of his bio. Faz, me and you have talked a lot about. You said you're giving up science. You're giving it up.
Well, yeah, I made a bit of a sort of an announcement in one of my videos that I wasn't going to be discussing scientific papers anymore moving forward, mostly because I think people want to hear more anecdote. They want to hear what I've experienced as in my own training or as a coach. But also I don't want to be one of those channels who leans into the science to prove a point, because I think there's a lot out there. I've got a point to make. Let me find an abstract, and then here it is, and sort of leans on that. And I think now where we're at in 2022, I personally think there's less credibility in somebody doing that. I would rather hear somebody saying, this is what I do, this is what I believe in, it's worked for me, it's worked for my clients, and on balance, let me adapt my view as I move forward. I think there's more credibility in that personally. So I don't want to get into the danger zone of potentially misinterpreting research or having conflicting research over the course of the next 5 or 10 years. So I've just done away with that altogether. I would rather look at the body of evidence.
You know, for me, it's been full circle. Like when I got in the industry, I was working for Muscle and Strength, and I jumped on their forums, and we had been having a lot of good conversations at the time on Muscle and Brawn about old school training styles. We would comb through everything, you know, from max OT to, you know, like we mentioned before, everything. We would just comb through everything, and we knew that frequency training was viable for hypertrophy. When I went to Muscle and Strength and started posting on their forum, this was around 2008, 9, whatever. They asked me to be fired, a couple guys in the forum, because I was mentioning frequency training, right, was viable. And then like transition like 3 or 4 years later, like when I would say bro splits are viable, people were calling me, like, I think I went through 3 or 4 years on YouTube where I was the fucking idiot that said bro splits were viable. So it's, you know, when you get into this whole science thing, you see the waves, you know, as the worm turns, you go through these cycles. And at the end of the day, man, you got to look at the bigger picture.
I do want to point out, though, at this stage, like I still read the papers and I'm trying to keep in touch with things. My point is just that the hypertrophy research as a whole is in its infancy. Like pretty much started with Matthias Wernbaum, 12, 13 years ago, and he sort of started to formalize. Now, we're at the point where we're still very much formalizing the language we use with hypertrophy research. Like, what is volume? We've pretty much just stabilized that. And that might be getting more condensed now into effective reps. We're not at the position where it's a prescription yet. We're still in the diaper stages. So I'm all for science. It's fantastic, but I just need to see a larger body of evidence first. I think the strength research is a lot more robust. It's solid, decades of that. But what we have for hypertrophy is very much in its infancy, and it's going to be refined a lot further. So I don't want to be just a reflection of the current trends in either the evidence-based circles or in the literature. That's all. That's my stance.
Yeah.
Still very much science-based.
I agree. And I think that part of the issue is just that when the research calls somebody trained that has 2 years of experience and can squat 315 for a single, like I just feel that person just doesn't compare to somebody with 15, 20, 25 years experience that's up against no progression for years and years at a time, to the point that where you wouldn't even see anything in a study. So I don't know how you can extrapolate what happens to like an early intermediate person to that of an advanced person.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. I mean, there are so many degrees and so the basic language and definitions that we have to establish. When you look at a hypertrophy study, I think we all do it. You know, when someone will say trained or untrained individuals, we know, all four of us, that there's so much nuance buried in there. There can be so much of a gap between individuals that it the study might not give us anywhere near an accurate output.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the training intensity argument as well. If you look at the research studies coming out of the Fisher and Steele lab over here in the UK, when they take those guys, their people to failure, they're really going to failure. And I interviewed James Steele on my channel, and he said one of the things he's working on to improve hypertrophy research as a whole is to actually provide a model of what training to failure and training intensity actually is. And he's trying to do that across all sports and all endeavors. He's trying to find something really big. I think that's going to contribute a lot to our own understanding of hypertrophy research and the application moving forward.
I love that the Steele lab is doing all that like super failure intense research, because like almost no one else is doing it in like a way that you would respect it, And then kind of along the same lines, we don't know how people are executing movements either. And that's like such a like is someone of 2 years experience really able to execute a movement in the same manner and precision that somebody with 15 or 20 years can? Maybe, but we don't know. So like something Berto proposed on my podcast was, why don't they just set up a phone that records the sessions and they can just bury it into the back of the research document and be like, hey, if you want to watch these form videos, go ahead, click it, and you can go check it out for yourself. Like that sounds so easy to me. I don't know why that just wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I've always wondered, because I would read a paper and then it'd be like, oh, subjects took this to momentary muscular failure, and it's like they're doing 45 sets per week, and it's just like really like 2 minutes rest and 1 minute rest, and they didn't lose reps and stuff like that. It's just like you can't read this stuff as a serious trainee and just not at least be a little bit skeptical. At the very least, it's going to be inconsistent, I think, or at least it has been so far. And so, the RIR impacts the volume you can do. And it basically, again, it impacts every single training variable, because, the levers are being pulled, but you don't know how hard, and then you don't know how much it impacts everything else. And that's training.
I mean, I made a video on rep drop-offs. This idea that as you do straight sets, your reps will drop off. And it was caused such a ripple effect in my viewers. Like a lot of people were like, this is all.
Yeah, I got attacked over it.
yeah. We had a fight over it. But yeah, a lot of people were like, this is all new information. But it means they're walking around doing sets of, say, 10, then 10, then 10, then 10, and calling each of those hard sets. You're like, whoa, this is a huge knowledge gap here.
It could go like 3, 2, 1 RIR though. Like if you're doing 3 sets of 10, it could be like 3 RIR, then 2 IR, then 1. So in theory, like if that's your progression approach and you just know that you want to hit 3 sets of 10 before you add weight or whatever, and you understand that there's going to be different RIRs. Like I was of the mindset even until recently that I would want to see that rep drop off instead. Like I'd rather see you go 10, 9, 8 and keep the same RIR the whole time than 10, 10, 10 with like an RIR drop off. But I've been in conversation with a number of people recently that use that like 3, 2, 1 RIR drop off where you do see the same reps across, and that seems to be super effective as well as one other option.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're fine. I think my issue is more the case that people think they're going 1 RIR and getting 10, 10, 10. That's where I'm like, whoa, no, you're not.
It works. I use for some of my assistants work on clients. I use something similar to what we're talking about, but they might do 3 sets of 8 or 3 sets of 10, but the last set I make them push for max reps, because I feel if we don't have some kind of a true test or indicator, then the first 2 sets can be just fairy tale land and pushed. If there's not a progression indicator in the mix on that last set, then we don't know if, like Bryan said, you could have 3 reps left in the tank or 2 reps left in the tank. But at some point, we have to test ourselves to make sure those are actually reps left in the tank.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where, if given the choice between training hard and progressing, go for progression every time, right? Like, It's one of those things where, train harder than last time. Okay, but like, what if you did the same exact workout and it was just harder? That's like the worst of both worlds. You'd rather have it actually be easier and then have that progression, right? Yeah. And then ideally you can progress and have it be easier as well. Like that's the best of both worlds. It doesn't happen very often, right? But it would be nice, right? Like if someone's a complete beginner, they go up in weight and it's easier. As a coach, I'm like, oh, hell yeah. Like, let's just keep going, right? But if they go up and it's a lot harder, and you sort of have to have this balance, again, it's like between progressive overload. Are you pushing it up, or is it just sort of arriving towards you? And both can sort of, it's this ebb and flow. Yeah. And beginners, they're moving up so quickly that everything can be linear. And then when you're intermediate, it slows down. And this is where intermediates are like, oh, what the hell? I can't add weight to the bar every single week. This is BS. And you're like, well, you're still progressing. It's just like you have to be a little bit, maybe you have to wave it a little bit, or you have to like step load or whatever. And then when you're advanced, like progression is so slow that the fluctuations in how you feel are going to be way bigger than just the actual progressions. And so you have to, maybe auto-regulate more. You have to really periodize and have a set progression. You might need to switch exercises more often to keep in one piece, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, at every stage of how quickly you're progressing, that is what separates beginner, intermediate, advanced, in my view. It's not how strong you are. It's how you can progress, right? And, so there's a sort of a wake-up call at every stage, from beginner to intermediate, and then intermediate to advanced. And to be honest, I'm just getting to be advanced, right? Like I put on about 5 pounds of muscle this year. That's a pretty clear sign that I'm not advanced, right? Because in my view, at least, advanced is like you're clawing for those little scraps, those little morsels, like a pound or 2 a year, something like that. Or in terms of strength. But also,
you're primed to be advanced, because numbers and progress aside, from an intelligence or an understanding standpoint, you can't step into that advanced world without being equipped.
Yeah,
I don't mean to cut you off, but it's true. I mean, you're going to get there, and you're going to be ready for it.
It becomes a thinking man's game when you become advanced.
Yeah. And I see the occasional person with a really, really good physique and who isn't advanced up here, but it's usually either genetics or drugs. Like, let's be real. But the people who don't have those two phenomenal factors working in their favor, and if someone has an impressive physique naturally, they had to think to get it. It doesn't just show up from hard work. Like, you have to be smart about how you set everything up. And, the past few years I've had to, really think and learn a lot, because, progress is not as easy as it used to be.
I always find it an interesting discussion, though, when we talk about how beginner, intermediate, advanced, the differences in how fast they gain and the complexity. A lot of it can also be heavily influenced by getting the rest of the stuff in place. So the diet, the rest, the recovery, and even just the training process, like the connection to the training. So I always find it's heavily influenced by those factors. So it makes it a very, very nuanced discussion. I think I like the guidelines. I use them myself, but I think there's a lot of nuance to that as well. If someone has just got crap sleep or et cetera, they'll make the progress with an advanced guy, and they can bench play it aside. So it's just interesting to talk about.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Geoffrey.
How to become an advanced lifter? Get 3 hours of sleep a night. Your progress will be Zero.
I want to change directions real quick and paint a picture for you guys and just get your reaction. You see somebody scroll through your Instagram feed. They're doing lat pull downs like at light speed. And in your head you hear like Beavis and Butthead, making that. Like they're just rapid fire, knocking out their reps. And at some point, for some of these guys, let me step back. When I trained, I learned to control the weight. So I wasn't just moving through progression. I was controlling the eccentric, not necessarily slowing the eccentric, but I was controlling the eccentric. I was getting the most out of the set I could. And at points, you see some guys just doing the opposite, chasing numbers at the expense of recklessness, super fast speed. They just take all the life out of their sets. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Actually, that was me. In my training log, my personal best on lateral raises, it's 25 kilos per hand, so 55 pounds for 50 reps.
You're doing like a clean high pull, basically.
Yeah.
That's a monkeypox. So yeah, exactly. It's like I'm not advocating like slow-mo reps or anything like that, or even counting tempo, but so many of these guys are just chasing numbers, and really they're just train wrecking their sets.
Yeah, I think that if you can institute pauses, especially as you're learning movement, pauses at the lengthen position, like using your pull down example, if you can get someone to just pause at the stretch position for the lat or the upper back or whatever region you're working, and then initiating that movement with like humeral depression versus initiating that movement just with some sort of thrusting of your torso to get that thing going. That combined with like some video footage where you can look at like, hey, this is what my first rep looks like, and this is what my last rep looks like before I go into like partial reps or whatever sort of intensity techniques. Like my first full rep should look just like my last full rep, just maybe with like a little more grindiness in there, right? So you can kind of self-assess that. But I fully agree, man. Using pauses and just consistent rep execution is something that everybody should be instituting into their programming.
Absolutely, yeah.
So a couple more things, and I'll hop off. I've been typing out some things I want to talk with you guys or discuss with you guys. Like we talked a lot about volume, and the guys that are just like do 3 RIR and do a lot of volume, and what does that even mean? When I got out on the road, back in the early days of YouTube, Muscle and Strength asked me to travel the roads of America and get video footage of Mr. North Carolina and Mr. Minnesota. And I got Stu Yellen from T Nation and all these different kinds of lifters. And I was just a naive knucklehead. And I got out to go film these top level naturals. And one thing one common theme that I learned from this experience was these guys are a hell of a lot stronger than I ever imagined. And they're doing a hell of a lot more volume than I ever imagined. Like almost to a person, these guys that were top level natties were just crushing volume, we're crushing heavy weight. So when I hear all these discussions about volume and 4 RIR, I'm like, I wish I could take my experiences, the things I've seen, and show these other lifters what it truly takes, to get to where they want to go. And it's not 3 RIR with random 22 sets of whatever.
Yeah. I guess we have to be careful with stuff like that, just because like around here, where I'm from, there's this whole shadow of Dorian Yates. And basically, if you ask any gym bro around here, if Dorian didn't do it, then it's just not worth doing. Like I've had guys literally defend quarter squats on the Smith machine to a bench, which are going to do nothing, to say, well, we do that because Dorian did it. And like, I think we have to be sort of very careful of falling into that trap of saying, well, if the big guy did it, then it's good, because there's a lot of variance in like people's prescriptions. And I think people are just going to have different, levels of volume and all that type of thing. So it's just something I like to point out, because like around here, there is that whole sort of everyone's just like chugging on Dorian's, riding on his crotch kind of thing, and it kind of grinds my gears. So I think we have to kind of figure out what do we need to move forward,
Yeah, well, I'm not I'm not trying to position it like that, but the thing that surprised me was just that everybody was a lot stronger than when they started. And you look at the average lifter on the internet, and they've gone this far, but they need to go this far. They might be training like this, but they need to train like this. We get in these discussions over little micro nuances and all the 3 hour, 4 hour, all this kind of stuff, when in reality the average lifter is so far away from the progression they need, or so far away from the average workout intensity. I think that's kind of the bigger point that I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I get a lot of DMs asking me questions that I would need to dig in and get a ton of information to actually give a good answer. And so, how much volume should I do? Which is better, dumbbell bench press or some other movement? And, what frequency? What's the best training split? And more often than not, I just say, try it out. As long as they're not asking something, really, really dumb, or if there actually is a clear answer. But usually it's just like, try it out, see if it works, take accountability of your own training and treat it as an experiment. Do a high volume phase, see how that treats you, moderate volume, low volume, modulate your intensity, just try it out and see what happens. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but either way, you've gotten some useful information.
Yeah.
All right, last topic for you guys, and then I'll let you go. And I appreciate you guys joining me. Let's touch on nutrition a little bit, because a lot of times when you bring up a nutrition discussion, everyone's like, yeah, nutrition, boring, eat food, whatever. But when you work with folks, you realize that there's so many issues with nutrition. Like, can we just be consistent? Can we just, like some guys are super low protein. Can we just get our protein up? Can we just stop binge eating on the weekend? Just to get people into a zone where they can actually get the most out of their training. Seems easy on paper, but I find it to be equally as challenging. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's huge. It's what I don't think when people stall on their training programs, I think most of the time it's probably not the arrangement of sets and reps, or the minutiae of the things that a lot of the things we've brought up today of what makes good for good entertainment in the evidence-based space. It's usually the other factors. Is the food consistent? Is there sleep and rest and recovery okay? I was planning on doing a video about this, saying something like, if you're stalled, it's probably not your routine, it's you, and it's just stuff you're doing. So yeah, I think there's a lot. It's a very important topic to talk about for sure.
I agree. I think that's kind of goes back to like the original bulking conversation, is like, there's so many people that are in their early stages of training, and if they think they're a hard gainer, or if they think that they have bad genetics or any of these things, it might just be that you're not eating enough food. And so that's always like my default answer to people if they're in their first few years and I get that DM that's like, hey, I think I have bad genetics, or like, where are my newbie gains and like all this stuff. I'm like, food, like more food, just keep eating, and like, there's definitely probably more advantage to eating mostly healthy, clean, nutrient dense foods, but there certainly comes a point in every bulk where you have to subsidize with some foods that are just going to be a little bit more calorically dense. And like,
I live vicariously through Geoffrey's Instagram for that.
Dude. All right. So you guys, like, you don't even know. I've been dieting now for 9 weeks, right? I'm like the smallest version of myself. Like, I feel so puny on this camera right now, but everything is appealing to me. So I hear these conversations of like, oh man, I'm so full. I can't even imagine eating more food. And I'm like, I feel hollow. Fuck off, you know? So no, all the food sounds good to me right now. But yeah, I think, focusing on the basics when it comes to food, like at least 3 meals a day, maybe 4, possibly 5, but 3 is probably a good number of protein doses for Steve's precious protein synthesis. And then from there, I'm not a huge stickler on fats and carbs. I think most people at this point are probably pretty open to like, hey, you can split those up in whatever way works best for you. I do tend to think that there are ways that probably work better for some people than others. Like for myself, I can't diet on like a moderate carb, moderate fat diet because I'm just hungry all the time. But when I go lower fat and really, can have 300, 350 grams of carbs on a diet, that way I can still feel satiated and not completely hollow all day long. So you find those little nuances that work for each individual and kind of optimize that process.
Yeah. So, I went back to my previous answer, like being aggressive in a bulk. It totally depends on your starting point and then the training and the individual. If someone is already 20% body fat or something, that's usually my personal cutoff. If someone comes to me and they're like, 22% body fat and they just want to bulk, it's a personal decision, but like, part of me is like, well, maybe let's just maintain and recomp because that's going to be probably just as good unless you want to be a football lineman or something. And, so it totally depends on your starting point and then how good the training is. I personally have a very big appetite. So, I've never struggled with gaining weight. But I have had clients who do. And, you might have to go with liquid calories or more tastier foods, more calorie dense foods, etc. And then there's also the opposite type of person where they have to more volumize, maybe even some anabolic diet type of foods. Although I don't think an excessive amount of that type of stuff is really the greatest idea. But yeah, it's super individual. And to me, that is the toughest part of coaching, right? Like setting up the training and assessing form and all that kind of stuff. That's not hard for me. I actually enjoy that. But yeah, getting that message where it's like, hey, I messed up on my diet again. I'm sure we've all gotten those. Those are tough to deal with. And it does take a lot of work. And it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, right? Like you have to know the person and empathize with them and be able to sort of provide the right solution for them. Not just like, 25 less grams of carbs or something, but actually provide them a more meaningful solution.
Yeah. I think in the world of coaching, it's like elementary school. Like during class time, that's your lifting time. Everyone lifts. Like everyone likes to lift that comes in. Everybody likes to lift. Some don't. There's a small percentage that struggle to do the work, but like with nutrition, it's like recess time. Everyone runs out of the room and goes all different directions, and you got to kind of lasso them or corral them or get them on on the path. And as far as like guys that need a lot of calories, or guys that are like, I just can't gain weight. There are some guys that have super high metabolisms. And they're sincerely trying. I've had some guys that, somebody I'm working with right now was hardly gaining any weight at all on 4,000 calories a day. And he'd be like, well, what do? I can't eat any more clean food. I'm like, ice cream and Doritos. Pretty much after 3,000 calories, that's the ice cream and Doritos range, right? You got in all the nutrients. You got in plenty of good nutrients. So, get yourself some Haagen-Dazs and some spicy chili Doritos and, cap out the day. But then you also have the guys that are like, I can't possibly eat this much. And really what they're saying to you is, I'm afraid of getting fat and don't want to eat this much. And that's a whole nother level of understanding your client.
Yeah, yeah. One of the downsides of like the whole G Shred incident was that, yeah, well, not a downside, but I got a lot of people contacting me who were clearly like just emaciated, you know, just not eating at all, and they're trying to get shredded, but there's nothing there. Like, you can't carve a pebble. There's just like, you're trying to get shredded, like, the heroes you see on YouTube and Instagram and stuff, but like, you've never really built the physique that you're trying to shred down to. And so, yeah, I've seen that quite a bit, where they're not really struggling to eat. They're just struggling to mentally get out of that box that they put themselves in. And I've advised people to just delete Instagram. Like, this is not helping. And, you're probably better off just ripping off the Band-Aid and not consuming this, because it's clearly not helping in terms of giving you a reasonable expectation for what a human male body looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you guys, but I find the hardest people to help, and I really want to help them, are the folks that are on the real small side and they're afraid of getting fat. They eat one big meal and all of a sudden they have some stomach bloat and they're panicking. And to this day, I find them to be the most challenging group of individuals to work with, because it's almost a disorder. They just can't leave that body dysmorphia or that fear that they're going to get fat. So I appreciate you guys joining me. I was going to get into the whole topic of main gaining and gaintaining and see if we could actually figure out in this video what the fuck it actually means. But anyway, I appreciate you guys joining me. Anytime you guys want to come back and do the hypertrophy Avengers, I'd love to have you. I know all you guys are stretched for time. So any last words or thoughts, Faz?
Really appreciate being on. Thanks for the invite, Steve, and really good to speak to both of you, Bryan, Geoffrey. I'd be up for another one of these absolutely anytime. But awesome, nice to meet you, gents, and thanks for the talk.
And Bryan, appreciate you having us on, or having you on. Where can they find you on Instagram?
Yeah, at Bryan Boorstein, Evolved Training Systems. And I also have a podcast, Eat, Train, Prosper. So we get a little bit more in the weeds on hypertrophy talk. So a lot of that stuff I talked about like progressing short overload movements differently than lengthened and all this sort of stuff. We talk about that stuff pretty regularly. We have guests on occasionally. But I echo all of what Faz said, and I'm just super honored and happy to be able to have connected with you guys. And I'm certainly down to come back on and do another one.
I appreciate it. It's always good to be able to get together and not have things devolve into discussions like what is failure. And Geoffrey, we've never heard of you. Where can we find you on social media and the YouTubes?
Yeah, it's my name. Yeah, it's I don't know. I couldn't think of anything cool, so I just typed in my name and then boom, channel. There we go, done.
Yeah, well, I am bound and determined to just take your name and change it to GVS and give you a Van Halen logo, and that's your brand. Just rock it, dude. All right, guys, I appreciate it. Thanks for joining me, and I'll talk to you guys next time.
Yeah, buddy. Thank you.
Cool. Take care.
Thank you.